Sweden, across the Atlantic Ocean toward the Western Hemisphere. They're getting close to land and end up sailing north into what later would become the Delaware Bay, sail further north into what would become the more narrow channel, the Delaware River. And they continued to sail, didn't go up as far as what is now Philadelphia, but they came across an uncharted river that went to the west off of, it's kind of a left turn off of the Delaware River to the west. And they sailed for about a mile, maybe a mile and a half, and they decided that they would put down their anchors. A bunch of rocks, big rocks along the sides of that river, put down their anchors and declared that spot the colony of New Sweden. It's what is now Wilmington, Delaware, colony of New Sweden. And they raised their flag and said, this is where we're going to make our stand. That was the, I think maybe the first European, at least in my state, the first European colony that was created, and it was created later and taken over by, I think, by the Dutch and then by maybe the British. But initially, it was the Swedes and the Finns who colonized that spot. Delaware has one of the newest national parks in America. And it's a different kind of national park that tells the story of Delaware's involvement in the earlier history of the settlement of our country, leading up to the ratification of the Constitution on December 7, 1787, which took place in Dover, Delaware, our state capital. And Delaware became the first state for one whole week. Madam President, we were the entire United States of America. And then we opened it up and fled in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and originally there, 47 or so more, including Wisconsin. And I think for the most part, it's turned out pretty well. We have had some bumps in the road, as the presiding officer knows. But the colony of New Sweden was in place for probably about 20 to 25 years. And then the Dutch took over, and then the British sort of took over the region in 1664. When the Dutch created the colony of New Sweden in what is now Wilmington, Delaware, they also built a church. And they built what is now known as Old Swedes Church. We've got a lot of churches in this country, a lot of different faiths. And the Old Swedes Church is believed to be maybe the longest continuously serving church in America. How's that for history? And as part of our national park that we created, something I worked on for years, we created in a decade or two ago, Old Swedes Church, and it's still there, still doing the Lord's work. This is a beautiful, beautiful picture. This is the Kalmar Nickel at full sail. This is one of the two ships that brought the Swedes and Finns to America, 384 years ago. This is the Swedish flag over here, and this is the Delaware flag over here. The Kalmar Nickel literally has a permanent place to be maintained and anchored along the Christina River. And when I went to the Biden station this morning to catch the train to come down here, as I do most mornings, Madam President. If I had just not gotten on the train and had headed downriver about a mile, I would have come to this ship right on the Christina River. It's sailed many places around the world. It's really the ship that represents our state, which used to be the colony of New Sweden. We all get to meet people from different places around the world. And I've been privileged to meet a lot of Swedish-Americans. And it turns out there are more Swedish-Americans than there are Swedes in Sweden. Let me say that again. There are now more Swedish-Americans than there are Swedes in Sweden. There's a bunch of them. And they contribute to our country and certainly to our state in many, many different ways. I work a lot in economic development, I always have as governor and even now. And some of the finest business people I've ever met are Swedes, or Swedish extraction. A funny story, if I could, Madam President. Everybody, 25 years, the King and Queen of Sweden come to revisit the colony of New Sweden. We have a big celebration for a couple couple of days right along the banks of this river, the Christina River, which, by the way, the Christina River, all those years ago when the first Swedes and Finns came ashore, they named the Christina River after their child queen, who at the time was, you won't believe it, 12 years old. 12 years, imagine peaking at the age of 12 and becoming a queen or a king. And Queen Christina, that river is named after her. I like to, whenever I run into women who name Christina, I tell them that their heritage, their name actually goes back to all those years when the first Swedes and Finns came here and helped to settle our country. Anyway, once every 25 years, the King and Queen of Sweden come to visit us. And in 2013, King Carl the 16th and Queen Sylvia of Sweden came to Delaware for several days. We had a huge celebration on the banks of the Christina River. And I had the privilege of sitting next to the Queen during dinner. This big banquet, hundreds of people, black tie, beautiful evening, great music, wonderful speeches. And she and I had just a delightful time talking over dinner. And I said to her, we talked about the arts. And I like films, and I believe the presiding officer is a big film buff. And one of our early favorite directors, Ingmar Bergman, great films for many, many years. And we talked about his films and the films that actually had touched our lives and helped shape our lives. And we talked about music. We talked about music. And I said to the Queen of Sweden, I said, I've always heard, I don't know where I've gotten this, Madam, Your Highness, I don't know where I got this, but for some reason I make a connection between you and the singing group ABBA. Now, Ingmar Bergman is one of the greatest film directors of all time. ABBA, Swedish swinging group, is I think maybe the top-selling singing group in the history of the world. And they actually still record from time to time. But anyway, I said to Queen Sylvia, I said, is there a connection between ABBA and you and your husband? Is there? She said, well, there is. And I said, well, what is it? And she said, the night before we were married in Sweden, she said there was a huge celebration and a concert, outdoor concert with tens of thousands of people. And she said the headlining group for the concert was ABBA. I said, no kidding. And I said, did they sing? And she said, that was the night they debuted the song Dancing Queen. Maybe one of the best pop songs I've ever heard. And I won't say that we sat there and hummed a few bars, but maybe we did. And but we had a lot in common with the Swedes and the Finns. We share a lot of likes and really very, very much appreciation, if you will, of the arts, including film and including music. We're a country that prides ourselves on our free enterprise system, but we have to do it with a heart. So do the Swedes. And this is, you look up the term no-brainer, and it's not, you won't find it in a dictionary. But if you look up a term no-brainer, Madam President, it would say, this vote today, and the issue that's before us. Why in God's name wouldn't we want the Swedes and Finns to join us together? Lisa Rochester's our congresswoman. We have only one. She's our congresswoman from Delaware. She has a saying. She talks about sticks tied together can't be broken. Sticks tied together can't be broken. One stick, you're going to break it. Tie a bunch of them together, you can't break them. And the same is true here. The same is true here. And the admission of Finland, admission of Sweden into NATO makes that band of sticks even stronger and that much harder to break. I'm just delighted that we have an issue that in the time that there's been a fair amount of dissension in these halls. I'm delighted that we have something that I think we can all, pretty much, almost all, agree on. This is a good thing. It's going to be good for our country. It's going to be good for Sweden. It's going to be good for Finland. And I think it's going to be good for our planet. And those of us who are privileged to live in what used to be the colony of New Sweden couldn't be happier. And we're delighted to celebrate. I would just say to anybody listening, say, well, you know, I've never been to a national park in Delaware. Well, we want you to know that we have one, and it's a great one, from one end of the state to the other. And if you start up north, get off the train, walk about a mile, you'll be at what used to be the home place, the starting place of the colony of New Sweden. With that, Madam President, I think I've done enough damage here today, and thank you for the time to speak. And I think we're going to yield to a fellow from Alaska, who is a man. I don't know that he spent a lot of time in ships or boats. I spent a few years in a Navy guy, but Marine, they spend a lot of time. They spend a lot of time at sea. They take rides in our boats. So we're on the same team. I like to say different uniforms to Senator Sullivan, but same team. And on this one, we're on the same page, and it's great to be there. Thank you. I yield.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Alaska.
Madam President, it's always good to follow my friend from Delaware, Navy Captain Carper, Vietnam vet, naval aviator, the whole works. So it's an honor to serve with him on EPW and other committees. So thank you, my good friend from Delaware. Madam President, I call up my amendment number 5192 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Alaska, Mr. Sullivan, proposes an amendment numbered 5192.
Madam President, after World War II, European leaders looked to the United States to help heal a fractured world and to help provide safety against increasing communist Russian aggression. As Winston Churchill said, quote, "There I sat with the great Russian bear on one side of me with paws outstretched, and on the other side, the great American buffalo." Well, the buffalo prevailed, NATO prevailed, and the world's most successful and enduring military alliance was born. In 1949, the Senate ratified the NATO treaty by a vote of 82 to 13. President Truman was quoted at the signing ceremony of the NATO treaty by saying, quote, "In this pact, we hope to create a shield against aggression and the fear of aggression. For us, war is not inevitable," he continued. "Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny. They can choose slavery or freedom, war or peace. The treaty we are signing here today is evidence of the path they will follow." That was when President Truman signed the first NATO treaty. And indeed, Madam President, since the formation of NATO, no world wars have broken out. No country that is a signatory of NATO has been invaded by another country's military forces. In fact, the only time NATO's Article 5, which is the pillar of the alliance, which states that an attack on one is an attack on all, was invoked was actually after the terrorist attacks on America on 9/11. Our allies came to our help to ensure Afghanistan wouldn't harbor terrorists. And we appreciate that help. We appreciate it deeply from our NATO allies. Madam President, NATO, however, is more than just a military alliance. It is a group of countries with shared values and beliefs and a commitment to the principles of democracy. All of this, in addition to the military alliance, is the heritage of NATO. President Ronald Reagan summed it up succinctly in a speech to our NATO allies in 1983, quote, "What do the Soviets mean by words like democracy, freedom, and peace? Not, I'm sorry to say, what we mean." Replace the word Soviet with Russia, and the sentiment unfortunately holds true today. We see the antithesis of these democratic values and shared beliefs of NATO being played out in real time before us in the streets of Ukraine, where Vladimir Putin is leading a brutal assault on Ukraine, Russia's democratic neighbor, and committing atrocities, horrible atrocities, against the brave people of that country. As both President Truman and Reagan remarked, members of the NATO alliance are like members of the same house and the same family, the house and the family of democracy. So today, the U.S. Senate will welcome the nations of Sweden and Finland into the NATO family. Like any family, we may not agree on everything, but when it's most important, we will have each other's back. That is the essence of NATO and the core reason for its success. Neither Russia nor any other country will be able to invade Sweden or Finland now, as they become members of NATO, without its NATO allies coming to their support. Of course, Finland has experienced the Russian invasion in 1939, where, without the help from other nations, its greatly outnumbered, brave Finnish army fought off over 1 million Russian forces for 3 months. But that won't happen again to Finland. And it won't happen to Sweden. They won't be alone now. We welcome these countries' commitment to freedom and their advanced professional militaries, which will make NATO stronger. And to Finland and Sweden, no longer will you be working with NATO, you will now be working in and part of the greatest defense alliance in history. So welcome to these great countries. As Churchill once said, there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them. So, Madam President, I strongly support the inclusion of these two great nations, Sweden and Finland, into the NATO alliance. Important occasions like this are also an opportunity to reflect on the obligations of membership, not just for these new NATO members, but for all NATO members. And on the heels of the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014, the heads of state and representatives of the then 28 member countries who made up NATO attended a very important summit, a NATO summit in Wales. There they agreed upon a common goal for all NATO members that they would spend a minimum of 2% of their gross domestic product on defense by 2024. This 2% of GDP NATO defense spending goal has been strongly supported for decades by American administrations, both Republican and Democrat. Presidents Bush, Obama, Trump, and now President Biden. At the time, in 2014, of the NATO summit in Wales, 10 of the 28 members of NATO met that 2% guideline. Now, 8 years later, in 2022, the 30 NATO country members, we only have 8 of those 30 meeting that 2% threshold. I have a chart here, lays out the 2% goal, who's above it, who's below it. It's many other countries besides the ones that are listed there, Madam President. But the bottom line is Since Wales, in that important commitment, there has not been much progress in NATO on this shared goal and commitment. Now, I am a very strong supporter of NATO and a very strong supporter of the U.S. military. And I want NATO to endure for decades to come. But alliances can't endure if shared commitments and shared burdens are not met. This is particularly true for democratic alliances like NATO. There must be a sense among the citizens of such countries that all are pulling their weight for the collective defense of the alliance, for the collective defense of each other. So as I mentioned at the outset, Madam President, I'm calling up an amendment to the resolution. My amendment is to make this commitment clear. It is to announce the U.S. Senate's expectation for all NATO members, the United States, existing members, and now new members, expectations on what has already been agreed to by each NATO country and its citizens. The amendment is simple. It states the following: the Senate declares that all NATO members should spend a minimum of 2% of their gross domestic product on defense and 20% of their defense budget on major equipment, including research and development, by 2024, as outlined in the 2014 Wales Summit Declaration. That's it. It's a simple amendment, Madam President, and I hope it can pass in the next hour by voice vote. Let me conclude with this. A robust, expanded NATO with Finland and Sweden and as new members is needed now more than ever, especially given the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We need to fully understand the broader implications of this invasion. We have entered a new era of authoritarian aggression, led by Russia and China's dictators, who are increasingly isolated and dangerous, driven by historical grievances, paranoid about their democratic neighbors, and willing to use military force and other aggressive actions to crush the citizens of such countries. These dangerous dictators, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, are increasingly working together to achieve their aggressive goals. We must wake up to the fact that this new era of authoritarian aggression will likely be with us for decades. We need to face it with strategic resolve and confidence. The United States has extraordinary advantages relative to the dictatorships of Russia and China if we are wise enough to utilize and strengthen them. Our global network of allies, our lethal military, our world-class supplies of energy and other natural resources, our dynamic economy, and most important, our democratic values and commitment to liberty. Xi Jinping and Putin's biggest weakness and vulnerability is that they fear their own people. We should remember this and exploit this in the months and years ahead. NATO, as an alliance, encompasses so many of these powerful comparative advantages: a lethal military, a global network of allies, dynamic economies, and the power of democratic values and the commitment to liberty. We should all welcome and celebrate the addition of Finland and Sweden to the NATO alliance, but we should also use this moment to recognize the seriousness of the authoritarian threats on the rise all over the world and recommit ourselves, members, to our obligations of collective defense moving forward. Madam President, I ask that in another section of today's record, I ask that unanimous consent that Senator Cornyn's statement be included in full.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
The senior senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I want to applaud the senator from Alaska for his comments. I agree completely with his statements, and I think his amendment making it clear that we expect the 2% to be honored by all member states is something that we all should welcome and agree to. So I thank you for your leadership. I also thank you for how you have articulated the importance of NATO to our national security. NATO is a transatlantic security partnership that has served our national security interests so well for so many years since the end of World War II. And today we're going to have a chance to vote to expand the NATO alliance by adding Finland and Sweden. I hope all my colleagues will support that. I will point out Finland already exceeds the 2% that Senator Sullivan is talking about, a percentage of their GDP that they're spending on defense. So I think this is another reason why we have countries that we want to add to the alliance. We have 30 strong now. This will even be stronger with Finland and Sweden being added to the NATO alliance. But, Madam President, what is unique about the two countries that we'll have a chance to vote on in a few moments is that they give us added value to our alliance. They make our alliance stronger. It's in our national security interest to include Finland and Sweden. They add value militarily and economically to this alliance. The geostrategic location of these two countries are critically important to our national security. Just think for a moment about the threats to the Baltic nations that we've seen by Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Think about where Poland has been threatened because of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Adding Finland and Sweden will help us round out the security alliance to provide the security that we need. Both of these countries are already committed to interoperability with the NATO alliance. They've already are familiar with how NATO's process and procedures are utilized. So we have two countries that are ready from day one to be active participants in the alliance. They both participate in regular participation and training exercises with NATO and U.S. forces. Both Sweden and Finland have done that. They have contributed troops. Sweden's contributed troops to the NATO-led operations in Kosovo, to Afghanistan, to Iraq. So we have countries that have already stepped up to help us in security and now will be a formal part of the security alliance. They'll add also a dimension that is important for us in regards to winter warfare. The cold response winter warfare exercises have been participated. Finland has the Arctic capabilities that are going to be critically important to us as we move forward. So we're adding value to the NATO alliance as well as expanding the number of countries. I want to mention one other area in cyber and misinformation. We have two countries that have been very active in being victimized by the misinformation campaign by Russia. They are very much, Sweden has a psychological defense agency that they created in 2016. That's going to be important for us. As we know, Mr. Putin uses every weapon in his arsenal, including misinformation, in order to try to bring down democratic states. We know that in Sweden's case, they are already taking decisive action to counter the misinformation. And Finland has an anti-fake news initiative, which is absolutely fascinating. They recognize that Russia is trying to invade their country through misinformation, and they have an active way of defending against it. So as I said earlier, we have two countries that will add value to the alliance. The timing here couldn't be better. We have stood up an international resolve to support Ukraine in the invasion by Russia. Expanding NATO at this moment is a clear message to Mr. Putin that we stand with the democratic countries of Europe, and we are prepared to expand our NATO alliance to guarantee their protection. So these two stalwart democratic nations, Finland and Sweden, have been robust partners to the United States and Europe on countless fronts. They have provided humanitarian aid to many countries in need, including Ukraine during the unprovoked invasion by Russia. Combined, Finland and Sweden have provided over $120 million in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine between February and June of 2022. These two nations have also shown a commitment to democratic governance, ranking third and fourth, respectively, on the Global Democracy Index of 2020, according to Economist Group. So we have two of the leading democratic states. Finland and Sweden have proven time and time again that they have the defense capabilities and commitment to democracy in Europe that make them essential NATO allies. The Senate must act now to bolster this global peace and security by voting in favor of Finland and Sweden's accession to the North Atlantic Treaty, and I urge my colleagues to do that. Madam President, I would ask that in a separate section from these remarks that I be permitted to enter comments about the one-year anniversary of the fall of Afghanistan, pointing out that the Biden administration has been able to assist in the evacuation of so many American citizens, some people that helped our U.S. mission, those that were involved in the democratic reforms in that country, but there's still a mission that we need to participate in to save people. So I would ask consent that those comments be included in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Maine.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the scheduled votes. Senator Collins for up to 10 minutes, Senator Graham for up to 5 minutes, Senator Blunt for up to 5 minutes, Senator Romney up to 5 minutes, Senator Risch up to 5 minutes, Senator Paul up to 10 minutes, Senator Sullivan for up to a minute, and Senator Menendez for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Heidi Zisselman, a fellow in my office, be granted floor privileges through August 4th, 2022.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise in strong support of the accession of Finland and Sweden into the NATO alliance. In May, I visited Helsinki and Stockholm as part of a Senate delegation to encourage the Finnish and Swedish efforts to join the alliance. Our trip, however, started in Ukraine. There, after a long secret journey under cover of darkness, our contingent of 4 senators met with President Zelensky for 2 hours. We discussed the military, humanitarian, economic, and security consequences of Russia's unprovoked, brutal war against Ukraine. I asked President Zelensky whether he thought Vladimir Putin's attack on his country had had the opposite effect of what he had intended. For example, the Russian-speaking sections of the eastern Ukraine are now embracing their Ukrainian identity, and NATO is more united than ever. President Zelensky told me that Putin's war of aggression not only had been the opposite of the easy conquest that Putin had expected, but also had strengthened the NATO alliance and the European Union. Mr. President, one cannot understate how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has upended decades, and in the case of Sweden, centuries of security policy for these countries. For 200 years, Sweden has maintained a policy of neutrality. But as Swedish Prime Minister Andersson put it to me, February 24th changed everything. That, Mr. President, was the date of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Finland, which shares an 830-mile border with Russia, likewise concluded that Russia's aggression required a dramatic rethinking of its security. To demonstrate the reality on the ground, the Finnish president took us outside of his home and pointed to his right, where Tallinn, Estonia, is only 50 miles away across the Baltic Sea. He then pointed to his left and told us St. Petersburg, Russia, is only 200 miles away. Our visits to these leaders came just as the parliaments of Finland and Sweden were voting to formally request admission into NATO. We assured their leaders that there was strong bipartisan support in the Senate for their accession, and that adding their capabilities to the alliance would improve, would strengthen our collective defense and security. And this is indeed an important point, Mr. President. Sweden and Finland will both bring enormous geographic advantages and military capabilities to NATO. Finland is expected to exceed NATO's 2% defense spending target this year, and Sweden has committed to meeting that target as soon as possible. Finland has the largest reserve military force in Europe and has recently decided to upgrade its current fleet of American F-18 fighter jets with the 5th generation F-35. For the past several years, Sweden has been increasing its arms spending, and the country has advanced defense industrial capabilities. The addition of both these nations to NATO will bolster deterrence against Russia in the Arctic, Nordic, and Baltic regions. For decades, Finland and Sweden have had a strong history of support for NATO. Their advanced militaries are, for example, interoperable with member nations. Both countries also have supported NATO-led operations over the decades, including in Afghanistan, Kosovo, and Iraq. They frequently participate in alliance-led exercises and capacity-building operations in Africa and elsewhere. During the current crisis in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden have been invaluable partners to the Ukrainians. They have been sending vital military aid to Ukraine, as well as humanitarian assistance since February, including anti-ship missiles, rifles, body armor, and anti-tank weapons. There are a few critics, Mr. President, who contend that this NATO expansion, which would more than double NATO's direct border with Russia, is somehow provocative to Vladimir Putin. This assertion ignores a clear pattern of Russian aggression extending back years. In 2008, Russia invaded its neighbor, Georgia. In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, occupying and seizing Crimea and areas of eastern Ukraine. Then earlier this year, of course, Russia launched the largest and most devastating land war in Europe since World War II, without any justification or provocation, when it invaded the free and democratic nation of Ukraine. Mr. President, this expansion of NATO is warranted precisely because of Russian provocations across the region. As always, NATO and the United States have no desire to see a war with Russia, but we will defend the territory and sovereignty of each of its members. Russia's brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has permanently changed the European security environment. Enlarging NATO to include two of our most capable and supportive European allies, Finland and Sweden, is a necessary and deliberative response. I urge all of my colleagues in a strong vote to join me in the swift ratification of Finland and Sweden's accession into NATO. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. One, I want to associate myself with the comments of Senator Collins from Maine. That was a great story about why we should all be happy about today with Finland and Sweden and why this makes a lot of sense. There's one person that I want to thank that I usually don't give a whole big shout out to is President Putin from Russia. Without you, we wouldn't be here. You've done more to strengthen NATO than any speech I could ever hope to give. John McCain, I wish you were alive today to celebrate, because what we've been able to accomplish here through Putin's invasion of Ukraine is to remind everybody in the world, when it comes to bullies, you better stand up to them before it's too late. So our friends in Finland and Sweden have decided to join NATO. That's a good thing. But let me put Ukraine in perspective right quick. Our military leaders and our experts told us after the invasion, 4 days they'd be in Kyiv. Well, they miscalculated. They overestimated the capability of the Russians, and they certainly undercalculated the resolve of the Ukrainian people. We're 160 days into this fight. Ukraine is still standing, bloodied but unbowed. NATO is bigger. Crippling sanctions on the Russian economy. The ICC is investigating war crimes committed by Putin and his cronies. You've got 100 United States senators. We can't agree on Sunday being a day off, have agreed that Russia should be a state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law. So 160 days in this fight, I'm telling you right now, things are looking pretty good for the good guys, and I say that knowing how much suffering has gone on in the Ukraine. But today we're here to admit 2 new members of NATO. NATO has been the strongest force for good, I think, on the planet since 1949. It's a group of countries organized around democratic concepts that have pledged to one another mutual defense. Attack on one is an attack on all. It's deterred war. It's been a stabilizing influence in Europe since the end of World War II, and along comes Putin. So NATO today is going to be bigger than it was before the invasion. NATO today is going to have more military resources than before the invasion by Russia into Ukraine. Again, I want to thank President Putin. You have done something for the democratic world that we have not been able to do for ourselves. To NATO, as an organization, keep your eye on the ball, pay your 2%. To my friends who suggest that expanding NATO makes us weaker against China, what movie are you watching? How can you believe for one moment abandoning Ukraine or showing less of a commitment to European stability will make China more afraid of us and less likely to invade Taiwan? The best thing we can do right now as a world, particularly the democratic world, is to become stronger in the face of aggression, to make NATO bigger, and we're going to accomplish that here in a few minutes. So to all my colleagues who have come down here and spoke on behalf of the admission of these 2 countries, God bless you, you're on the right side of history. And one regret I do have is my great friend Senator McCain could not see today come about, because he would be exceedingly pleased that the democratic world has rallied in the face of aggression by Putin. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I want to join my colleagues in my appreciation for the expansion of NATO. As others have said, the greatest alliance maybe in history, certainly in the last 200 years. and an alliance that has served great benefits and now is growing. You know, NATO's been there since 1949. The two countries that we're going to be voting to admit today have resisted since 1949 being part of NATO, but with the recent actions, they've decided you now have to choose a side. Now, they are not countries that have been on the sideline just hoping nothing would happen. They're countries that had significant defense capacities, significant military capabilities. They'll be net security contributors to NATO. They bring to the alliance these advanced capabilities. They bring a neighborhood understanding of Russia that has greater than maybe almost any other country, particularly Finland, with, has been mentioned, that 800-plus mile border that will double the NATO border with Russia. They've been defending that border since World War II, and the Russians understand their capacity to defend it. They frankly bring good real estate and good location. The Baltic, I wish I had a map here on the floor with me, but I don't have. The Baltic really becomes a NATO sea, and that's an important thing. Norway already in NATO, Sweden joining NATO, Finland joining NATO, right across from the three Baltic countries that are much more in need of assistance than these two countries that are joining an alliance that will give them that assistance. It's an incredible day for NATO, the Baltic Sea, the Arctic. I've heard more, Mr. President, on this floor and in this country about the Arctic in the last 5 years than I think we've talked about in the previous 25 years. The Arctic basically becomes NATO territory with the sole exception of Russia. The United States, Canada, Norway, Sweden, Finland become the countries that are bound not only in the neighborhood to the Arctic, but also in a supportive alliance. You know, we've been hearing about how China wants to become an Arctic power. I think the change in NATO makes it incredibly harder for China to become an Arctic power or for Russia to become an Arctic abuser, and we're seeing that happen right here. Again, great capability. The Swedes have an Air Force, a Navy. They have the best cyber offensive and defensive capability in Europe. That large industrial base. Finland just agreed to buy 64 F-35s to replace their F-18s. Both countries have been working with us in military exercises for years. They are virtually immediately interoperable. They bring capacity to the NATO alliance that it doesn't have without them. I'm grateful that they're joining. Finland already at the 2% goal of their commitment to their own national defense. Sweden will be there by 2028. Senator Durbin, who's here on the floor with me, and I met with both of these countries recently, and they are absolutely committed that this is the moment when the NATO alliance takes on new meaning, not only to their two countries, but I think to, and not only Western Europe, but frankly to the world. This is an alliance that stands for shared values, that stands for border integrity, that stands for being sure that those things go into the future. I urge all of my colleagues to vote for this today. I'm glad we're able to be among the first. We were hoping we'd be the first country to approve the admission into NATO of these two countries. But we'll be among the first. I think it sends a signal to the world and hopefully to all Americans that not only is NATO important, but it will be stronger with Sweden and Finland than it has ever been. And I look forward to the opportunity to cast this vote today.
Mr. President,
The senator from Utah.
I rise to oppose the Paul Amendment to the Resolution of Advice and Consent to Ratification for the Accession of the Republic of Finland and the Kingdom of Sweden to NATO. Like virtually all of my colleagues, I heartily support the admission of Sweden and Finland into NATO. Their commitment to democracy, their military capabilities, and their resolve in the face of Russian aggression is welcome. With Russia's unprovoked attack on Ukraine, NATO has been united in providing support for the Ukrainians to defend themselves. NATO is also united in its adherence to the provisions of the NATO treaty. The world is watching to see if there are any cracks in that commitment, particularly with respect to its provisions for mutual defense. We must not in any way appear to be going wobbly on Article 5. I fear that the Paul Amendment would do just that. Further, Senator Paul's amendment is unnecessary. The NATO treaty specifically states this, quote, "This treaty shall be ratified and its provisions carried out by the parties in accordance with their respective constitutional processes." That's in the NATO treaty itself. So adding the language of the Paul Amendment would only add confusion and potentially communicate to the world that this body seeks something in addition to the adherence to the constitutional process that the treaty already requires. Now, it's well and good for Congress to consider war powers and our role in military conflicts, but doing so as part of the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO, while Ukraine is under attack and while Russia may potentially be eyeing violence against NATO nations, is surely not the time. Our commitment to NATO and to Article 5 must be clear and unambiguous. Throughout our nation's history, the United States has not once ratified NATO protocols with a reservation. I'm going to say that again to make sure I get it right. Throughout our nation's history, the United States has not once ratified NATO protocols with a reservation. Now should be no different. Doing so could send the wrong message to the people of Ukraine, to our other friends and allies. It could even be propagandized as a nod to Putin. I urge my colleagues to vote down Senator Paul's amendment. Our message must be clear. We stand with NATO, with Article 5, and with the admission of Finland and Sweden into our alliance. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
I ask unanimous consent to speak for 5 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, I hope that my remarks are even less. I stand in solid support of the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO. Just a few weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to visit Lithuania. It's a country which means a lot to me personally and to my family. And I met with the former president, Vala Adamkus. Adamkus, a Lithuanian immigrant to the United States, had a distinguished record in our government service here and then returned to Lithuania after his retirement from the U.S. federal government and ran successfully for president. He had the vision to realize that the future of Lithuania and the Baltic states was in the European Union and NATO, and worked strenuously to achieve those goals, and I was happy to be joining him in that effort. Now, this moment in history really complements his leadership, because the accession of Finland and Sweden to to NATO, is a confirmation that the Baltic Sea is safer than ever when it comes to the West. If Vladimir Putin thought that by invading the Ukraine, he could somehow inhibit the future of NATO or in some way limit its future, the opposite has occurred. NATO is stronger than ever, and the United States' commitment to NATO is stronger than ever. The fact that only a handful of senators from either political party are even questioning the accession of Sweden and Finland are good indications to me that we have bipartisan support for this NATO coalition now more than ever, and we should. First for the Ukrainians, and secondly for the United States and its future. Those who are speaking against the accession of Finland and Sweden suggest that we ought to focus our attention anew on Asia. Well, we cannot ignore Asia. It's an important part of our near-term future, and we've got to show strength throughout the world. Why don't we start right now with this accession of Finland and Sweden? The strengthening of the NATO alliance says to any adversary of the United States, even to China in its future, that this country does business with other countries in the world on an arm's length basis and a respectful basis, and can deal with democracies in a constructive way in building their economies for the future. I will gladly join in the support of the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. I believe it not only strengthens that alliance when it comes to this war in Ukraine, it prepares us for challenges in the future, and it's the right thing for America's security. I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, today I rise and urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the accession protocols for Finland and Sweden to join NATO. This is probably one of the easiest votes I'll ever make in the United States Senate. I've listened to arguments about Asia somehow, that it comes in here. Look, this is we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Certainly we need to look at what's going on in Asia, pay attention to what's going on in Asia, but what we're talking about here is the defense of the North Atlantic. And this organization was put together many years ago. It has grown over those years to be 30 strong, and now we're going to add 2 more. NATO has been I have characterized it as the most successful political and military alliance in the history of the world. Certainly the most powerful alliance in the history of the world. And today we have the opportunity to expand the alliance by including Finland and Sweden. Now, over the years, we've added various countries, and debates could be had about those countries as to whether or not they are sufficient to join NATO and be part of the Article 5 attack on one. It is an attack on all alliance. But on Finland and Sweden, there really is little, if any, argument. These are 2 very successful countries. And this accession process is an important chance for the U.S. to demonstrate leadership in NATO. We have over the years, and we will continue to do so, and the United States' commitment to its modernization and to its future. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has carefully consulted and coordinated with our NATO allies, the governments of Sweden and Finland, with the administration, within the Senate itself, to ensure this process could move as efficiently as possible. I can tell you that personally, and others have done the same over recent years, and particularly over recent months, have pressed Finland and Sweden to change their view as to whether or not they should remain neutral and instead move into the NATO alliance. And on February 24th, we all know the world shook. Things changed dramatically. After Putin's unprovoked attack on Ukraine, Sweden and Finland, I'm sure, woke up and said, you know what, that could be us next. But it won't be us if we join NATO. And so their polling in their country changed dramatically on February 24th as to whether or not NATO membership was appropriate for them. They have now enthusiastically said NATO is appropriate for them. And we have shown in this body bipartisan support for Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Finland and Sweden will make model members of the NATO alliance. Both have strong and capable militaries in place now and are already net contributors to the security alliance. As is pointed out earlier by Senator Collins here, they have been very active in NATO, even though they're not members of NATO, by participating in various drills that have taken place, and also by participating in the duties that NATO does, strengthening the eastern flank of NATO. They've also demonstrated interoperability with NATO, which is extremely important, and commitment necessary to join the alliance. I would say that today, with what's going on in Ukraine, Finland and Sweden joining the alliance is even more important. When the shooting's over in Ukraine, it won't be over. NATO's going to re-examine what they need to do to strengthen themselves. And certainly one of those will be an examination of hardening the eastern flank. And Finland and Sweden obviously are on the eastern flank. Will add considerably to that. And not only that, it's going to cost more to defend the eastern flank simply because of what Russia has done. And Finland and Sweden will be a contributor, as will everybody in NATO. Adding these 2 nations as full members of our alliance will further deter any temptation by Russia to engage in military adventurism in the Baltic and Arctic regions. I believe Russia is already deterred when we say, and our NATO allies say, the European nations say to Putin, not 1 square inch whether it's on the eastern border of one of the Baltic states, or whether it's in downtown London or in the United States. An attack on any of the NATO countries is an attack on all of them, and the response will be swift. Today's ratification of Finland and Sweden as new members of NATO will both send a strong message of transatlantic unity to Putin, strengthen NATO against Russia's growing threat. NATO was put together originally to push back on Russia, and it's obvious that that need has not gone away. I want to urge my colleagues to vote yes. This is a really easy vote. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Kentucky.
today the Senate will vote to expand the NATO alliance to include Sweden and Finland. A crucial question that should be answered is whether Sweden and Finland's ascension to NATO is in America's best interest and whether their joining will cause more or less war. Well, for every action there is a reaction. What do our adversaries say? Well, Putin's immediate response was that Russia does not have a problem with Sweden or Finland applying for NATO, but that the expansion of military infrastructure into this territory will, of course, give rise to reaction and response. So from Russia's perspective, they likely will tolerate Sweden and Finland in NATO, but likely will not tolerate certain weapon systems in Finland or Sweden. Advocates of NATO expansion say we can't be held hostage to Russia's threats. Perhaps, but if a country announces they will do X if you do Y, shouldn't someone at least contemplate the potential scenarios? The Russians have already announced that placing certain weapon systems in Finland is a red line. Whether the red line is justified is not the issue. The issue is, knowing your adversary's position, is it worth the risk of pushing missiles into Finland? The world has changed since Putin invaded Ukraine. Arguments that admitting Sweden and Finland to NATO could provoke Russia are less potent now, since Putin's war shows that he can be provoked by actions short of Ukraine's actual admission to NATO. Diplomats, though, should try to envision how the Ukraine war might end. One possible end would be, as Zelensky has stated, a neutral Ukraine, not militarily aligned with either the West or the East. Neutrality doesn't have to always be a weakness. Neutral nations can serve as intermediaries in conflict resolution. Often, our discussions with Iran use neutral Sweden as a conduit. When all nations are aligned, who will be the mediators? The world will soon lose the important roles played by a neutral Finland and Sweden. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed the world. In this new world, I am less adamant about preventing NATO's expansion with Sweden and Finland. But I am still adamant about the reality that NATO's expansion will come at a cost. I'm here today to propose a reservation to ensure that this expansion will not come at the expense of losing our ability to determine where and when the United States goes to war. My reservation merely reasserts that Article 5 of the NATO Treaty does not supersede Congress's constitutional responsibility to declare war before the U.S. commits troops to war. The founders designed the separation of war powers to ensure that the decision to engage in hostilities would be made only after serious deliberation, according to our Constitution. The United States would resort to war only after the collective wisdom of the people's elected representatives determined war is in the best interest. We know this because our founders told us so. At the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention, James Wilson stated that the proposed Constitution would not allow one man or even one body of men to declare war. In Federalist number 69, Alexander Hamilton explained that the president would be restricted to conducting the armies and navies which Congress alone would raise and fund. The father of our Constitution, James Madison, argued, in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature. Some have argued that a vote for my amendment is to go wobbly on NATO's Article 5 commitment. I would argue that Gold Star parents and our men and women in the field don't want Congress to go wobbly on the Constitution. There is no more serious question that we are entrusted to answer than whether to commit the men and women of the armed services to war. We cannot delegate that responsibility to the President, to the courts, to an international body, or to our allies. This is our constitutional responsibility, one that we have freely taken and one that our constituents expect us to uphold. I also want to assure my colleagues here that adoption of my reservation will not jeopardize the NATO treaty. Some will argue, while the substance of my reservation is unobjectionable, the process of adopting the reservation threatens the expansion of NATO. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is true that reservations must be accepted by the other parties, but the other parties are NATO allies. The other parties are NATO allies who are all dependent on us to come to their rescue. You think they're going to lecture us on obeying our own Constitution? We should expect those allies to respect Article 11 of the NATO Treaty, which states that the provisions of the treaty are to be carried out in accordance with each country's respective constitutional process. Additionally, my reservation does not require any other country to take action or renegotiate the treaty. The reservation will be deemed accepted if our allies do not object after a period of 12 months. I call on my colleagues to support my proposal to reaffirm that our Constitution and the NATO treaty are abundantly clear. Our international obligations do not supersede Congress's responsibility to declare war. It's in our Constitution, it's the supreme law of the land, and we should today reassert that we will obey the Constitution above all else. I call up my amendment number 5191 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will record.
Senator from Kentucky, Mr. Paul, proposes an amendment numbered 5191 to the resolution of ratification to Treaty Doc number 117-3.
Dispense with the reading. President.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, as we bring to an end this debate about the accession treaty for Sweden and Finland, I've been listening in my office to my colleagues' comments, and I think it's all been very constructive. But I do have a different view, on some points that have been made that I think are wrong. And before this body casts a vote, I think they should understand why. I appreciate Senator Paul's focus on Congress's prerogatives with respect to war powers. Like Senator Paul, I have a deep respect for the critical role that the Constitution assigns to Congress in this area, and I believe our democracy is stronger for it. But I rise to convey that Senator Paul's amendment is unnecessary, unprecedented, and if adopted, will be deeply damaging to NATO and our relationship with NATO allies. That is why the Foreign Relations Committee, in marking up these treaties, overwhelmingly, in a bipartisan vote, voted down a substantively identical amendment offered by Senator Paul. The amendment before us today is not necessary. There is no question that the North Atlantic Treaty and the Finland and Sweden protocols do not and cannot supersede the Constitution. No treaty can. This is a well-established and well-understood point that the Supreme Court has reaffirmed. The amendment, however, would be deeply damaging to our core national security interests. Neither the United States nor any other NATO ally has ever insisted on a reservation, a statement that would limit and call into question our adherence to NATO obligations. But that's exactly what this amendment does. If adopted, it would be shared with all NATO members and would signal to them that we are limiting our obligations to NATO with regard to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. If we go down this road, we can expect that other countries will do so as well, gutting the core commitment that NATO members make to each other. Particularly at this time, with Putin's rampage in Ukraine, his energy war against Europe, and his constant saber rattling, it would be self-defeating to do anything that casts doubt on our rock-solid commitment to NATO and our NATO allies. So let me reiterate. There is no question that neither the treaties we are voting on today nor any treaty can supersede the Constitution. That position is clear in law and clear in logic. The Constitution is supreme. From there, we have one task before us, providing advice and consent to Finland and Sweden's accession in a manner that strengthens the NATO alliance and strengthens our allies. The amendment before us would do the opposite. And for those reasons, I oppose that amendment and urge all of my colleagues to do so as well. Finally, let me address some of the other critics of Sweden and Finland's accession to the NATO alliance. Each day we fail to act, we send a message of indecision and division. Some Republican critics oppose Sweden and Finland joining NATO because they are worried about the cost to the United States. But that is simply untrue. Sweden and Finland will reduce these costs. Instead, we should be asking, what is the cost of delaying NATO expansion? What is the cost of debating protection for Europe's democracies? What is the cost of denying security to Sweden and Finland? I'll tell you, these 11th-hour concerns standing in the way of this process only serve Putin's interests. Other critics want an amendment undermining Article 5 of the NATO Charter that says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. But as I said before, this was overwhelmingly rejected by both sides of the aisle in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then there are still others who say we shouldn't accept Sweden and Finland into NATO because China, not Russia, is our greatest foreign policy threat. Well, let me just say one thing. If you want to make sure you meet the China challenge, the first thing you want to do is defeat Russia in Ukraine. Xi Jinping is looking at what's happening in Ukraine. He's looking at what the West is doing in Ukraine, and he's making calculations as it relates to Taiwan and elsewhere in the world. You want to make sure that you defeat Russia in Ukraine. And let me also say that as someone who has worked on foreign policy for 3 decades and who is intimately aware of the danger and risk that China poses, we have to be able to meet that challenge in multiple dimensions. Sometimes we face more than one threat at the same time. Sometimes our values and commitments compel us to stand up for what we believe in. And this is one of those times. Putin's regime continues to push and probe for weakness. And NATO is the best institution we have to check his push for power across the continent. Over the course of the last 70 years that NATO has existed, it has used an open-door policy when it comes to accepting new member countries. These countries must be functioning democracies. They must treat minorities fairly. They must resolve conflicts peacefully, be able to contribute to the NATO alliance. This criteria describes Sweden and Finland to a T. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes to accept these prosperous democracies into NATO, vote yes to reduce the costs on the United States and the entire military alliance, vote yes to embracing the values and modern militaries of Sweden and Finland, vote yes to having these 2 democracies join us, vote yes to strengthening the North American Treaty Organization today. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I just spoke an hour ago on the floor, and I'm a very strong proponent of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. I am also a very strong supporter of NATO, and I want the alliance to endure for decades to come. But alliances can endure if shared commitments and burdens are not met. This is particularly true for democratic alliances, where there must be a sense among the free citizens of such country that all are pulling their weight for the collective defense and shared goals they all agree to. So, Mr. President, the amendment I just called up an hour ago, S5192, is meant to make this clear. Simply states that the U.S. Senate expects all NATO members to spend a minimum of 2% of GDP on defense spending as agreed at the NATO summit in Wales in 2014. This will make NATO stronger, as will the accession of Finland and Sweden as new members. And I ask for a voice vote on this amendment.
Under the previous order, the question is on the Sullivan Amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on the Paul Amendment. Yes, Senator from Idaho. Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Oh, it's up. Yes, I did. Sure. Let me get these. No? Okay, got you. Thank you. Got you. You are, thank you. Okay. I got Schumer. Yeah, okay. Fisher's next.
Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Resch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative: Lankford, Paul. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blackburn, Bozeman, Burr, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Gillibrand, Graham, Haggerty, Hassan, Hawley, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kane, Lujan, McConnell, Menendez, Murray, Padilla, Reed, Risch, Romney, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Sinema, Smith, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Whitehouse, Wicker, Young. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Tuberville, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Crapo, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Rounds, no. And Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Cardin, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Moran, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Ms. Collins, no. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Kramer, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Miss Rosen, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Grassley,
What's it to you?
no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, no.
There you go. Wow. Just came to.
Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Markowski, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no.
Order. The yeas are 10, the nays are 87. The amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, any committee conditions, declarations, or reservations as applicable are agreed to. The question occurs on adoption of resolution of ratification as amended.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
May we have some order, please, Madam President?
Senate will come to order.
Thank you. Since its creation over 70 years ago, no alliance in human history has done more to advance the cause of freedom and democracy than NATO. Today, at a moment when democracy in Europe is under attack, as belligerent autocrats like Putin clamor for European dominance, the U.S. Senate is voting in overwhelming bipartisan fashion to approve Finland and Sweden's accession to the NATO alliance. This is important substantively and as a signal to Russia. They cannot intimidate America or Europe. Thank you, Roger.
Come to order.
Thank you, Madam President. Putin has tried to use his war in Ukraine to divide the West. Instead, today's vote shows our alliance is stronger than ever. I applaud the leaders of Sweden and Finland, who made a bold choice to depart from their long-held position with respect to NATO. I'm confident they'll be excellent partners in this alliance. I thank Leader McConnell. Back in May, we met with the Finnish President and Swedish Prime Minister and promised to approve their accession as quickly as possible. And today, we're keeping that promise. I also want to thank my colleagues from both sides of the aisle for springing into action in this matter, especially Senator Menendez, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who did such a good job with his ranking member, Senator Risch, as well as Senators Shaheen and Tillis, who have been our leaders in reaching out to NATO for their leadership roles. Senator Menendez and Risch ensured their committee acted quickly. And on a broader note, Madam President, in the past few months, we've seen an amazing string of bipartisan achievements in this chamber, achievements rarely seen in such fast succession. We passed the first gun safety bill in 30 years, approved the largest investment in U.S. science and technology in generations, gave veterans the largest expansion of benefits in decades, and today we're strengthening the NATO alliance. And all of this, every bit of this, was done on a bipartisan basis. I've always said this Senate Democratic majority would be willing to work with the other side whenever possible, and these past months have been some of those moments. Finally, to the Swedish and Finnish diplomats who have worked for months to reach this moment, rest assured you have many friends in this chamber. We promise to get this done, and we will always, always stand by your side as allies defending each other. I thank my colleagues for their work and ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mrs. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Bozeman, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Cortez Masto, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Duckworth, Ernst, Feinstein, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Heinrich, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Kane, Kelly, Kennedy, King, Lee, Marshall, McConnell, Menendez, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Romney, Rosen, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Padilla, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Senator Hawley voted in the negative. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 95, the nays are 1, and 1 senator responded present. 2/3 of the senators present, a quorum being present, having voted in the affirmative, the resolution of ratification is agreed to. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions, and the Senate will resume legislative session. The Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business for debate only, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the nomination of Robert Gordon. Earlier this year, Mr. Gordon had strong bipartisan support in the Finance Committee when his nomination came to a vote. Mr. Gordon is President Biden's nominee to serve as the Department of Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary for Financial Resources, and he has a long history of dedication to public service. More recently, he served as Director of the Department of Health and Human Services for the state of Michigan. He played a central role in the state's pandemic response and managed an agency of 14,000 employees and a multi-billion-dollar budget. Before that, he held senior roles in the U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Management and Budget, where he championed evidence-based policymaking to use taxpayer dollars wisely. Earlier in his career, Mr. Gordon served as a senior official at the New York City Department of Education. He was a senior aide on Capitol Hill, a law clerk for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and a White House aide. In his time at the White House, he supported the development of the AmeriCorps program. In his long career in public service, he's worked to ensure that government programs work for those they serve, and that they do so through responsible use of taxpayer dollars. Such experience is essential to the work of the Assistant Secretary for Financial Resources at the Department of Health and Human Services. HHS has responsibility for critical programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and the Children's Health Insurance Program, just to name a few. The Assistant Secretary for Financial Resources must ensure that these programs and many others under the umbrella of the department remain strong for future generations. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that as if in executive session, the Senate consider the following nomination. Calendar number 762, Robert Michael Gordon, to be Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, that the Senate vote on the nomination